The espresso machine hissed and steamed as Alexandra Reeves wiped down the counter for the third time in 10 minutes. The morning rush at Fort Henderson's main coffee shop had died down, leaving only the lingering aroma of dark roast and the soft hum of refrigeration units. She adjusted the green apron tied around her waist and glanced at the clock. 9:15, right on schedule. The bell above the door chimed as Major Brett Hawthorne strutted in, his polished boots clicking against the tile floor with practiced authority. His uniform was immaculate, every crease sharp enough to cut paper, every ribbon and badge positioned with military precision. Behind him followed Captain Troy Kelland, a man whose swagger seemed borrowed from someone more important. "Coffee girl," Hawthorne called out without looking at her, his voice carrying the casual dismissiveness of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Large black coffee, none of that fancy stuff. And make it quick. Some of us have real work to do." Alexandra's hands remained steady as she reached for the largest cup. "Of course, sir. Coming right up." Her voice carried no trace of irritation, no hint of the observations she was mentally cataloging. Hawthorne's leadership style, the way Kelland mirrored his superior's arrogance, the casual disrespect they showed to what they assumed was civilian support staff. Kelland leaned against the counter, studying his reflection in the polished surface. "You know, Brett," he said loud enough for Alexandra to hear, "I don't understand why they hire these civilian contractors for jobs like this. Military personnel could handle coffee service just fine." Hawthorne nodded sagely. "Budget cuts, Troy. They'll hire anyone these days. Probably cheaper than using real soldiers for this kind of work." Alexandra's movements remained fluid and professional as she prepared the coffee, but her mind was recording every word, every gesture, every revealing moment of their character. The hot liquid filled the cup with a satisfying gurgle, and she snapped on a lid with practiced efficiency. "Here you are, sir," she said, extending the cup toward Hawthorne. "That'll be $3.50. The major dropped a $5 bill on the counter without ceremony. "Keep the change," he said with the magnanimous air of someone bestowing a great favor. "Maybe save up enough tips, and you can afford some real training for something more useful." Before we continue with this story, drop a comment and let us know what state you're watching from. Maybe you've witnessed workplace disrespect like this in your area. Kelland chuckled at his superior's wit. "Good one, Brett. Though I suppose someone has to make the coffee, right?" Alexandra slid the change across the counter toward Hawthorne, her expression remaining pleasant and professional. "Thank you for your business, gentlemen. Have a productive day." As the two officers walked away, their conversation drifted back to her. "Did you see the way she looked at us?" Kelland was saying. "Like she thought she was somebody important or something." Hawthorne's laughter carried across the small space. "These civilians always think they're part of the team just because they work on base. Someone should remind her what her place is around here." Alexandra continued wiping down surfaces that were already spotless, her movements methodical and purposeful. 23 years of military service had taught her patience, had shown her the value of observation over immediate reaction. She had commanded troops in 3 combat zones, had earned commendations for leadership under fire, had risen through ranks that few women had ever reached. But today, she was Alexandra the barista. Today, she was gathering intelligence on the true culture of Fort Henderson, assessing the character of its officers when they thought no one important was watching. The mission parameters were clear: observe, document, and evaluate the leadership climate that had prompted several formal complaints about toxic command culture. The coffee shop door chimed again. Sergeant First Class Maria Santos entered with the measured pace of someone who understood the value of both efficiency and courtesy. Her combat boots were scuffed but clean, her uniform bearing the honest were of someone who worked for her rank rather than inherited it through privilege or politics. "Good morning, Alex," Santos said, approaching the counter with a genuine smile. "The usual today." Alexandra's demeanor shifted subtly, warming in the presence of someone who treated her as a human being rather than an inconvenience. "Absolutely, Maria. Extra shot of espresso, light cream, no sugar. How's the morning treating you?" Santos leaned against the counter, her posture relaxed but alert. "Can't complain. though I had to break up another argument between some of the newer recruits earlier. Kids these days don't seem to understand the difference between confidence and arrogance. The espresso machine whirred to life again as Alexandra prepared the sergeant's drink. It was a careful observation, one that aligned perfectly with what she had been witnessing during her weeks undercover. The base had a growing problem with leadership modeling, where junior officers were learning the wrong lessons about command presence and respect. Speaking of arrogance, Santos continued, lowering her voice slightly. I couldn't help but notice Major Hawthorne and his crew in here earlier. They giving you trouble again. Alexandra's hands never paused in their work, but she appreciated the sergeant's genuine concern. Nothing I can't handle, Maria. Some people just have their own way of seeing the world. Santos accepted her coffee with both hands, a gesture of respect that wasn't lost on Alexandra. Well, for what it's worth, you handle their nonsense with more grace than they deserve. Takes real character to maintain professionalism when people are being deliberately disrespectful. The comment struck deeper than Santos could know. Alexandra had spent years in leadership positions where maintaining composure under pressure wasn't just professional courtesy. It was the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. She had learned to read people, to understand their motivations, to see past surface behaviors to the character beneath. I appreciate that, Maria. Really. Alexandra's voice carried genuine warmth. It means more than you might think. The coffee shop door opened again, admitting Lieutenant Jake Morrison. Unlike Hawthorne and Kelland, Morrison moved with the uncertain gait of someone still finding his place in the military hierarchy. His uniform was correct, but somehow less comfortable, as though he were wearing borrowed authority. Morrison approached the counter, but kept glancing toward the door, as if expecting his superiors to materialize at any moment. Hi, he said to Alexandra, his voice lacking the commanding tone he was clearly trying to project. I'll have whatever Major Hawthorne usually gets. Alexandra noted the choice immediately. Not a personal preference, but a deliberate mimicking of his superior's habits. Large black coffee coming up, she said, beginning the familiar routine. Santos watched the exchange with interest, her experienced eye-catching the same details that Alexandra was cataloging. Morrison was following patterns rather than developing his own leadership style, a dangerous trend that often led to the perpetuation of toxic command cultures. Actually, Morrison said suddenly, his voice gaining slight confidence, make that a medium, and maybe add some cream. It was a small act of independence, but Alexandra recognized its significance. Good choice, she said encouragingly. Everyone's taste is different. Morrison's shoulders relaxed slightly at her supportive response. Yeah, I guess you're right. I mean, coffee is coffee, right? Santos milid approvingly. That's the spirit, Lieutenant. No point in pretending to like something just because someone else does. As Morrison paid for his coffee, Alexandra could see him processing the sergeant's words. It was a teachable moment, one that might help him understand that authentic leadership came from genuine self-knowledge rather than imitation of others. The lieutenant left with a slightly straighter posture and a more natural expression. Through the window, Alexandra watched him walk across the courtyard, noting how his gait had shifted from forced authority to something more genuine. That kid has potential, Santos observed, following Alexandra's gaze. Just needs to figure out who he is instead of trying to be someone else. Alexandra nodded, thinking of all the young officers she had mentored over the years. The good ones always started with that same uncertainty, that same struggle to find their authentic voice in a system that often rewarded conformity over character. The morning sun streamed through the coffee shop windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Alexandra's mission was proceeding exactly as planned, each interaction revealing more about the complex dynamics that shaped Fort Henderson's command climate. The afternoon shift brought its own rhythm to the coffee shop, slower but more deliberate than the morning rush. Alexandra had learned that these quieter hours often revealed more about people's true character than the hurried interactions of peak times. She was restocking cups when the familiar sound of confident footsteps announced Major Hawthorne's return. This time, he wasn't alone. Captain Kelland flanked him on one side, while two other officers Alexandra hadn't seen before completed their small formation. The group moved with the swagger of men who believed their presence commanded automatic respect. Well, Hawthorne announced loudly, gesturing toward Alexandra with theatrical surprise. Our little coffee expert is still here. Don't you have anything better to do than serve beverages all day? Alexandra looked up from her task, her expression remaining neutral and professional. Just doing my job, sir. What can I get for you today? Kellen stepped forward with a smirk. Actually, we were just discussing something interesting. The captain's voice carried the tone of someone about to deliver what he considered a clever observation. We were wondering what someone like you could possibly know about military operations. I mean, making coffee is one thing, but understanding real military strategy. The two unknown officers chuckled at Kellen's comment. One of them, a major with thinning hair and soft features, leaned against the counter. Yeah, I bet you think you understand how this base operates just because you work here. Alexandra's hands continued their work, steady and purposeful. She had faced enemy fire with less internal tension than she felt watching these officers display such casual cruelty. Every word, every gesture was being cataloged for her eventual report on command climate and leadership effectiveness. You know what I think? Hawthorne said, his voice taking on a more aggressive edge. I think civilians like her get ideas above their station. Start thinking they're part of the team just because they serve coffee to real soldiers. The soft-featured major nodded enthusiastically. Exactly. There's a clear hierarchy here, and everyone needs to understand their place in it. Some people serve, others lead. It's that simple. Alexandra finished restocking the cups and turned to face them directly. Her posture remained relaxed, but something in her bearing shifted almost imperceptibly. Gentlemen, she said calmly, hierarchy works best when it's based on competence and respect rather than assumptions and intimidation. The statement hung in the air like a challenge. Hawthorne's eyes narrowed as he processed what she had said. The casual dismissiveness in his expression began to harden into something more dangerous. "Excuse me," he said, his voice dropping to a more menacing register. "Did you just lecture me about military hierarchy?" Alexandra met his gaze steadily. "I simply observed that effective leadership tends to inspire respect rather than demand it through intimidation." Kellen stepped closer to the counter, his posture becoming more aggressive. "Listen here, coffee girl. You might want to remember who you're talking to. Major Hawthorne has more military experience in his little finger than you'll ever have." The irony of the statement wasn't lost on Alexandra, who had spent more years in active combat zones than Hawthorne and Kellen combined. But her mission required maintaining cover, even in the face of increasingly hostile behavior. "I'm sure he does," she replied evenly. "I was simply making a general observation about leadership principles." The fourth officer, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke up. "You know what bothers me most about civilians on base?" His voice carried the flat effect of someone who enjoyed causing discomfort. "They think they can hide behind their contractor status and say whatever they want without consequences." Hawthorne smiled at his colleague's comment. "That's an interesting point, Lieutenant Colonel Davies. Maybe someone needs to file a formal complaint about attitude problems among the civilian staff." Alexandra felt the familiar surge of combat awareness, the heightened alertness that had kept her alive in hostile territories around the world. These officers were escalating beyond casual disrespect into active harassment, creating a hostile work environment that violated every principle of professional military conduct. But she also recognized something else in their behavior. This wasn't just about her. This was a pattern, a systematic approach to intimidation that they had clearly used before. The easy coordination of their harassment suggested practice, experience, a refined technique for making people feel small and powerless. Staff Sergeant Carmen Rodriguez chose that moment to enter the coffee shop, her timing unknowingly perfect. The veteran NCO took in the scene immediately, her experienced eye reading the tension and power dynamics with practiced efficiency. "Afternoon, Alex," Rodriguez said cheerfully, her voice cutting through the hostile atmosphere. The usual, if you don't mind. The officers' formation shifted slightly, their aggressive posture moderating in the presence of an NCO who commanded genuine respect throughout the base. Alexandra seized the moment to begin preparing Rodriguez's drink, grateful for the interruption. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez's presence shifted the entire dynamic of the room. Her reputation preceded her everywhere on Fort Henderson, earned through 15 years of exemplary service and an unwavering commitment to treating every person with dignity regardless of rank or position. The hostile officers found themselves adjusting their postures, their aggressive energy suddenly feeling inappropriate under her steady gaze. "Gentlemen," Rodriguez said with polite acknowledgement, nodding toward the group of officers. "Afternoon, Major Hawthorne, Captain Kelland." Hawthorne's response came with noticeably less swagger than his earlier pronouncements. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, good to see you." Alexandra prepared Rodriguez's usual order, a medium coffee with 2 sugars and a splash of vanilla creamer. The routine felt almost ceremonial in its normalcy, a return to professional courtesy after the escalating hostility of the previous moments. "Alex here makes the best coffee on base," Rodriguez said conversationally, accepting her drink with both hands. "Always gets the proportions exactly right. Takes real attention to detail." The comment was casual, but carried deeper meaning. Rodriguez had a gift for recognizing competence wherever she found it, regardless of job title or social position. Her endorsement carried weight throughout the base, and everyone present understood its significance. Lieutenant Colonel Davies shifted uncomfortably. "Of course, Staff Sergeant. I'm sure she does her job adequately." Rodriguez's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes sharpened. "Adequately," she repeated, tasting the word like something unpleasant. "That's interesting terminology, sir. In my experience, excellence is usually recognizable when you encounter it." Alexandra found herself admiring Rodriguez's subtle defense. The staff sergeant wasn't directly confronting the officers, but she was making it clear that their casual dismissiveness didn't align with her own observations. Kelland attempted to redirect the conversation. "We were just discussing the importance of everyone understanding their role on base. Clear hierarchies, proper respect for authority, that sort of thing." Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. "Absolutely, Captain. Mutual respect is fundamental to effective military operations. Leaders who earn genuine respect through competence and character tend to be far more effective than those who demand it through intimidation." The statement landed with surgical precision. Alexandra watched the officers' faces as they processed the staff sergeant's words, recognizing both the wisdom and the implied criticism contained within them. Hawthorne's jaw tightened slightly. "Of course, Staff Sergeant, though I think we can all agree that civilian contractors need to remember their place in the chain of command." Rodriguez took a thoughtful sip of her coffee before responding. "In my experience, Major, the most effective bases are ones where every person feels valued for their contribution, regardless of whether they wear uniform. Competence and character matter more than job titles." Alexandra continued cleaning equipment that didn't need cleaning, using the mundane task to mask her intense focus on the conversation. Rodriguez was articulating principles that Alexandra had spent her career implementing, lessons learned through years of leading diverse teams in challenging environments. Davies cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the discussion. "Well, I suppose different people have different perspectives on leadership." "That's true, Sir," Rodriguez agreed, "though some perspectives tend to produce better results than others. The bases with the highest morale and effectiveness ratings are usually the ones where leaders focus on bringing out the best in everyone, not putting people in their place." The tension in the room had shifted, but not disappeared. The officers found themselves defending positions they couldn't articulate clearly, while Rodriguez continued to advocate for basic human decency with the quiet confidence of someone whose principles have been tested and proven. Alexander realized she was witnessing something significant. Rodriguez wasn't just defending a barista from harassment. She was modeling the kind of leadership that made military organizations truly effective. The staff sergeant understood that respect couldn't be demanded or enforced through rank alone. It had to be earned through consistent demonstration of competence, integrity, and genuine concern for others. Hawthorne glanced at his watch with exaggerated urgency. Well, we should probably get back to our duties. Some of us have important meetings to attend. The dismissal was clearly intended to end an uncomfortable conversation on his terms. But Rodriguez simply nodded pleasantly, unaffected by the subtle slight. Of course, Major. Duty calls for all of us. She turned back to Alexandra with a warm smile. Thanks for the excellent coffee, Alex. Same time tomorrow. Certainly, Alexandra replied. Always a pleasure, Carmen. As Rodriguez left, the officers found themselves in an awkward position. Their harassment campaign had been quietly but effectively neutralized by someone whose authority came from respect rather than rank. They couldn't continue their aggressive behavior without appearing petty and unprofessional. One by one, they filed out of the coffee shop, their earlier confidence replaced by uncomfortable silence. Alexandra watched them go, mentally adding another layer to her growing assessment of Fort Henderson's command climate. The evening shift at the coffee shop usually brought a different clientele, soldiers winding down from their duties, staff catching up on paperwork over caffeine, and the occasional officer grabbing a late pick-me-up. Alexandra had been restocking pastries when the first urgent radio chatter crackled from the base communication system mounted near the entrance. All units be advised. We have a credible security threat reported at the main gate. Repeat, credible security threat at main gate. All personnel maintain heightened awareness. Alexandra's hands stilled on the display case as her trained instincts immediately engaged. 23 years of military service had taught her to decode the subtle urgency in radio communications, to read between the lines of official announcements. This wasn't a drill or routine security check. The tension in the dispatcher's voice suggested something genuinely concerning. Lieutenant Morrison burst through the coffee shop door, his face flushed with a combination of excitement and anxiety. His uniform showed signs of hasty preparation, buttons slightly misaligned, hair not quite regulation perfect. "Did you hear that announcement?" he said breathlessly to Alexandra. "Security threat at the main gate. This could be serious." Alexandra nodded calmly, while her mind automatically shifted into tactical assessment mode. "What kind of threat?" she asked, her voice carrying professional interest that might seem natural for a civilian concerned about base safety. Morrison shook his head uncertainly. "Nobody's saying exactly. Could be anything from suspicious packages to potential infiltration. The base commander just called an emergency staff meeting." More radio chatter filled the air, this time with increased urgency. "All section chiefs report to command center immediately." Repeat, all section chiefs to command center. This is not a drill. Alexandra felt the familiar surge of command responsibility, the instinctive need to take charge and coordinate response efforts. But her cover identity required her to remain in place, to maintain the role of concerned civilian employee rather than experienced military leader. The coffee shop door opened again, admitting Captain Kelland and Major Hawthorne. Both officers moved with the hurried energy of people responding to unexpected crisis, but Alexandra's experienced, "I caught something troubling." Their movements lacked the purposeful coordination she would expect from seasoned military leaders. Instead, they seemed almost frantic, reactive rather than strategic. "Morrison," Hawthorne called out sharply. "What are you doing here? All junior officers are supposed to be coordinating with their units." Morrison straightened instinctively. "Yes, sir. I was just grabbing coffee before reporting to my section chief." Kelland scanned the coffee shop with obvious agitation. "This is exactly the wrong time for coffee breaks. We could be dealing with a real security breach here." Alexandra watched their interaction with growing concern. In genuine crisis situations, effective leaders maintained calm focus while ensuring clear communication and coordinated response. What she was observing looked more like panic than professional emergency management. The radio crackled again with new information. "Base perimeter has been secured. 9 units are conducting sweeps of all major buildings." All non-essential personnel should remain in current locations until further notice. Hawthorne ran his hand through his hair, a gesture that spoke of stress rather than control. Non-essential personnel, he muttered. How are we supposed to know who's essential and who isn't in this kind of situation? The comment revealed exactly what Alexandra had feared. These officers lacked the crisis management experience to effectively coordinate emergency response. Their confusion about basic security protocols suggested dangerous gaps in their preparedness. Kellen pulled out his phone and began frantically scrolling through messages. I can't get through to Colonel Whitmore's office. The lines are all busy. Alexandra's instincts screamed at her to intervene, to provide the calm leadership that could help coordinate their response efforts. She had managed far more complex crises in combat zones, had developed emergency protocols that saved lives, and completed missions under impossible circumstances. But maintaining her cover was essential to the larger mission. Her assessment of Fort Henderson's leadership capabilities was proving even more critical than originally anticipated. If these officers represented the base's crisis response leadership, then serious systemic problems existed that went beyond simple morale issues. Morrison looked between his superiors with obvious uncertainty. Should I report to my unit or stay here and help coordinate communications? The question hung unanswered as both senior officers seemed paralyzed by their own indecision. Alexandra realized she was witnessing a leadership vacuum at exactly the moment when decisive action was most needed. Another radio transmission cut through the tension. All units maintain current positions. Preliminary sweep of main gate area complete. Investigation continuing. The update should have provided some relief, but Hawthorne and Kelland seemed even more agitated than before. Their inability to process information effectively and translate it into appropriate action was becoming more apparent with each passing moment. Alexandra began calculating how long she could maintain her cover while watching potentially dangerous leadership failures unfold around her. The coffee shop had transformed into an unofficial command post as more personnel filtered in seeking information and guidance. Alexandra found herself in the surreal position of serving beverages while watching a crisis unfold through the lens of military leaders who seemed increasingly unprepared for the situation they faced. Sergeant First Class Santos appeared in the doorway, her expression serious but controlled. Unlike the officers who had been flailing about, she moved with the purposeful efficiency of someone who understood her role in emergency protocols. Sir, she addressed Hawthorne directly, Colonel Whitmore has requested that all department heads coordinate through the main communication center. He specifically mentioned that scattered response efforts are hampering the investigation. Hawthorne's face flushed with embarrassment and frustration. Of course we know that, Sergeant. We were just gathering preliminary information before reporting. Santos nodded diplomatically, but Alexandra caught the brief flicker of doubt in her eyes. The sergeant had clearly recognized the same leadership deficiencies that Alexandra was documenting. The radio crackled with another update. 9 sweep of Building 7 complete. No suspicious materials detected. Units proceed to Building 12 for continued investigation. Kelland grabbed the radio near the coffee shop entrance as if to respond, then hesitated when he realized he had no authority to communicate on that frequency. His gesture revealed both his desire to appear involved and his fundamental misunderstanding of crisis communication protocols. Morrison watched his superiors with growing uncertainty. The young lieutenant was beginning to recognize that the leadership he had been emulating might not be as competent as he had assumed. Alexandra could see him processing the disconnect between military training and the reality he was witnessing. Sir, Morrison ventured carefully, should I coordinate with Sergeant Santos to establish proper communication with the command center? Before Hawthorne could respond, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez entered the coffee shop. Her presence immediately brought a sense of calm professionalism that contrasted sharply with the agitation of the officers. Gentlemen, she said evenly, Colonel Whitmore has established clear protocols for this situation. All personnel are to report through their designated chain of command rather than clustering in common areas. The statement was delivered with respectful authority, but its implications were unmistakable. The officers were not following proper emergency procedures, and their presence in the coffee shop was actually counterproductive to effective crisis management. Hawthorne's jaw tightened at the implicit criticism. "We're perfectly aware of proper protocols, Staff Sergeant. We were ensuring that civilian personnel understand their safety requirements." Rodriguez's gaze shifted briefly to Alexandra, who had continued working throughout the crisis with remarkable composure. "I'm sure Alex understands the situation perfectly well. She's demonstrated excellent judgment throughout her time here." The comment carried layers of meaning that weren't lost on Alexandra. Rodriguez had observed something in her behavior that suggested more competence than a typical civilian contractor might possess. Another radio transmission cut through the tension. "Security Team Alpha, report to Sector 4. Possible breach detected in perimeter fencing. All other units maintain current positions." The news sent a visible jolt through the assembled group. A possible perimeter breach represented a significant escalation in the security threat, potentially indicating actual infiltration rather than a false alarm. Alexandra's mind immediately began calculating response scenarios, evaluating tactical options, and assessing resource allocation requirements. Her years of combat experience automatically engaged, running through standard security protocols and emergency management procedures. But she watched with growing alarm as the officers around her seemed to freeze rather than spring into action. Hawthorne and Kelland exchanged uncertain glances, neither apparently sure how to process this new information or what actions they should take. Santos stepped forward with quiet authority. "Sir, I should report back to my unit to coordinate perimeter security measures. We'll need to ensure all access points are properly monitored." "Yes," Hawthorne said quickly, seizing on her suggestion. "Yes, do that, and keep us informed of any developments." Alexandra realized she was witnessing something that could have serious consequences for base security. The officers who should have been coordinating emergency response were instead relying on NCOs to provide direction and leadership. The inversion of expected command relationships suggested systematic problems that went far beyond individual competence issues. Rodriguez caught Alexandra's eye for a brief moment, and something in her expression suggested that the experienced staff sergeant was reading the situation with similar concern. The base's emergency response was being managed by people who understood their responsibilities rather than those who held the official authority to direct them. The radio crackled again with increasing urgency. "All units be advised. We have visual confirmation of unauthorized personnel in Sector 4. Repeat, unauthorized personnel confirmed. Initiate lockdown procedures immediately." The announcement sent a chill through the coffee shop. What had begun as a security alert was now a confirmed breach, requiring immediate and coordinated response from every level of base leadership. The lockdown announcement triggered immediate chaos throughout the coffee shop. Hawthorne began pacing frantically while Kelland fumbled with his phone, trying to reach superiors who were already overwhelmed coordinating the emergency response. Morrison stood frozen, clearly waiting for direction that wasn't coming from his supposed leaders. "All personnel remain in current locations until further notice," the radio continued. "Security teams are conducting sweep operations. Do not attempt to leave buildings without explicit authorization from command staff." Alexandra watched the scene unfold with increasing alarm. A confirmed security breach required immediate, coordinated action from every level of leadership. Instead, she was witnessing a dangerous vacuum where decisive authority should have existed. Santos had remained in the coffee shop despite her earlier intention to return to her unit, apparently recognizing that the officers needed supervision more than her own section needed her immediate presence. She moved to the radio system with natural authority. "Command Center, this is Sergeant Santos in Building 6. She spoke clearly into the microphone. "We have 3 officers and 2 civilian personnel secured. Requesting status update on Sector 4 situation." The response came immediately. "Building 6, maintain current status. Sector 4 sweep in progress." Estimate 20 minutes for area clearance. Rodriguez nodded approvingly at Santos's professional communication. At least someone was following proper protocols and maintaining contact with command authority. Hawthorne suddenly stopped pacing and turned toward the group. "We need to establish our own communication center here," he announced with forced authority. "Monitor the situation and coordinate with other units." The suggestion revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of crisis management principles. During emergency situations, effective leaders consolidated command structures rather than creating additional communication nodes that could confuse or duplicate efforts. "Sir," Santos said diplomatically, "Colonel Whitmore has specifically requested that all communication flow through the established command center to avoid conflicting information." Hawthorne's face reddened at what he perceived as contradiction from an NCO. "Sergeant, I think I understand proper command structure better than you do." The comment hung in the air like a challenge. Alexandra found herself gripping the edge of the counter as she watched an experienced NCO being dismissed by an officer whose incompetence was becoming more apparent with each passing moment. Rodriguez stepped forward with calm authority. "Major, perhaps we should focus on ensuring everyone's safety rather than establishing competing command structures." Before Hawthorne could respond, the radio crackled with urgent new information. "All units, security breach has been contained. Repeat, breach contained. 2 unauthorized individuals apprehended in Sector 4. Maintaining lockdown pending full area sweep." The update should have brought relief, but Kelland immediately began arguing that they should investigate the situation themselves. "We need to get out there and assess the damage," he declared. "This is exactly the kind of situation that requires officer oversight." Morrison looked between his superiors with obvious confusion. "But sir," the radio said to maintain lockdown. "Shouldn't we follow those orders?" Kelland waved dismissively at the lieutenant's concern. "Those are general orders, Morrison. Officers have discretion to make tactical decisions based on developing situations." Alexandra felt her composure beginning to crack as she watched dangerous leadership failures compound upon each other. These officers were preparing to violate direct orders from base command, potentially compromising ongoing security operations and putting personnel at risk. Santos and Rodriguez exchanged glances that communicated their shared concern. Both NCOs recognized that they were witnessing behavior that could result in serious consequences for base security and mission effectiveness. The radio provided another update. Perimeter sweep teams report all clear in sectors 1 through 3. Continuing operations in sectors 5 and 6. All personnel maintain current positions. The clear directive should have ended any discussion about leaving the coffee shop, but Hawthorne was now fully committed to his misguided course of action. "We have a responsibility to assess this situation firsthand," he declared. "Real leaders don't hide in coffee shops during security incidents." Alexandra realized that the situation had reached a critical point. These officers were about to make decisions that could compromise ongoing security operations and potentially endanger lives. Her duty as a military officer was beginning to override her mission requirements for maintaining cover. She found herself calculating how much longer she could remain silent while watching leadership failures that violated every principle of effective military command. The tension between her undercover role and her responsibility as a senior officer was reaching an unsustainable level. Rodriguez caught her eye again, and this time the staff sergeant's expression carried unmistakable questions. Something in Alexandra's demeanor was clearly registering as inconsistent with her supposed civilian status. Hawthorne moved toward the exit with determined purpose, his decision to ignore direct orders from base command apparently final. Kelland followed closely behind, their combined confidence feeding off each other in a dangerous display of misguided leadership. "Major," Santos called out with urgent concern, "I really must recommend that we follow the lockdown orders. The security teams need clear operational areas to complete their sweep." Hawthorne paused at the door and turned back with visible irritation. "Sergeant, I appreciate your concern, but officers are trained to make tactical decisions in fluid situations. This is exactly the kind of leadership moment that separates real commanders from people who just follow orders blindly. Alexandra felt something snap inside her chest. 23 years of military service, multiple combat deployments, and countless life-or-death leadership decisions had taught her to recognize dangerous incompetence when she saw it. These officers weren't demonstrating leadership. They were exhibiting the kind of reckless ego that got people killed. "Sir," she said quietly, her voice carrying a new quality that made everyone in the room pause. "I don't think that's a wise decision." Hawthorne turned toward her with surprise that quickly shifted to anger. "Excuse me, did a civilian contractor just try to give me tactical advice?" Alexandra met his gaze directly, feeling the weight of her true identity pressing against the constraints of her cover story. Sometimes civilians have experience that might be relevant to military situations. The statement was carefully worded, but something in her tone made Rodriguez step closer, her experienced instincts clearly detecting something significant. Kellen laughed harshly. "What kind of experience could you possibly have that would be relevant to a security breach? Making coffee doesn't exactly qualify you for tactical operations." Alexandra's composure finally began to show cracks. The casual dismissiveness, combined with the officer's dangerous decision-making, was pushing her past the breaking point of her undercover mission. "Gentlemen," Rodriguez interjected with firm authority, "perhaps we should all take a step back and consider our options carefully. Security situations require clear thinking rather than emotional reactions." But Hawthorne was now fully committed to his course of action, his ego demanding that he follow through regardless of the consequences. "We're leaving to assess the situation," he declared. "Real officers don't hide behind cover while their base is under threat." He reached for the door handle, just as the radio crackled with new urgency. "All units be advised. Secondary breach detected in Sector 7. Repeat, secondary breach in Sector 7. All personnel maintain strict lockdown." This is a direct order from base commander. The announcement should have immediately halted any discussion about leaving the building. A secondary breach indicated a coordinated attack that required absolute adherence to security protocols. Instead, Hawthorne seemed to interpret the news as validation of his decision. "See," he said triumphantly, "multiple breaches. This is exactly when officers need to be out there coordinating response efforts." Alexandra watched in horror as he actually began opening the door. Her military training screamed that his actions could compromise ongoing security operations, potentially revealing the locations of response teams to hostile forces still at large. Santos moved quickly toward Hawthorne. "Sir, I cannot allow you to violate direct orders from the base commander during an active security incident." The sergeant's intervention represented a direct challenge to officer authority, something that could have serious consequences for her career. But her commitment to base security and proper military procedures outweighed personal considerations. Hawthorne spun around with fury. "Are you seriously trying to detain a superior officer, Sergeant?" The confrontation had reached a point where military discipline and proper authority were breaking down completely. Alexandra realized that she was witnessing a complete failure of command structure at exactly the moment when effective leadership was most critical. Morrison stood paralyzed between conflicting loyalties, unable to reconcile his training with the reality of watching his superiors make obviously dangerous decisions. Rodriguez positioned herself strategically near the radio, ready to communicate with base command if the situation deteriorated further. Alexandra found herself calculating whether maintaining her cover was worth allowing potentially catastrophic leadership failures to continue unchecked. The tension between her undercover mission and her fundamental duty as a military officer had reached an unsustainable point. The radio crackled again with increasing desperation. "All units, hostiles still at large. Maintain lockdown positions. Any unauthorized movement could compromise ongoing operations." Hawthorne's hand remained on the door handle as he faced the opposition that had formed against his decision. The standoff in the coffee shop had reached a critical moment. Hawthorne's hand remained on the door handle while Santos positioned herself to physically prevent his departure. The violation of military hierarchy was unprecedented, but the sergeant's commitment to following proper orders outweighed personal consequences. Major Hawthorne, Rodriguez said with careful authority, "Sergeant Santos is correct. Direct orders from the base commander during a security incident are not subject to individual interpretation." Hawthorne's face had turned deep red with rage. He was trapped between his ego-driven decision and the growing opposition from NCOs who clearly understood proper military protocol better than he did. "This is insubordination," he snarled at Santos. "I'll have you court-martialed for interfering with an officer's duties." Santos stood her ground with quiet dignity. "Sir, my duty is to the base commander's orders and the safety of this installation. I cannot allow those to be compromised." Alexandra watched the confrontation with increasing anguish. Every instinct she possessed as a military leader demanded that she intervene, but doing so would blow her cover and potentially compromise weeks of intelligence gathering about Fort Henderson's leadership climate. The radio provided another urgent update. Security teams have visual contact with remaining hostiles. All personnel maintain absolute silence and stillness. Any movement could alert targets to our positions. The message could not have been clearer. Even the slightest unauthorized activity could endanger the lives of security personnel and compromise the mission to neutralize the remaining threats. Kellen stepped up beside Hawthorne in a show of solidarity. "Brett's right," he declared. "We can't let enlisted personnel dictate what officers can and cannot do." Morrison remained frozen between competing loyalties, his training telling him to follow orders while his immediate superiors demanded the opposite. The young lieutenant's confusion was evident as he struggled with the impossible situation. Alexandra realized that the confrontation was about to escalate beyond verbal disagreement. Hawthorne's ego would not allow him to back down in front of subordinates, even when he was clearly wrong. His next action could have catastrophic consequences for base security. "Sir," she said quietly, stepping forward with deliberate purpose. "Perhaps there's another way to approach this situation." Hawthorne whirled toward her with explosive anger. "Stay out of this, civilian. This is a military matter that doesn't concern you." But Alexandra had reached the point where her duty as a senior military officer overrode all other considerations. "Actually, Major, military matters concern me more than you might realize." Something in her tone made everyone in the room pause. Rodriguez's eyes narrowed as she studied Alexandra's face, clearly recognizing that something fundamental had just shifted. Alexandra took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would end her undercover mission, but potentially save lives and prevent a catastrophic breach of military discipline. "Major Hawthorne," she said with quiet authority that seemed to fill the entire space, "I am ordering you to step away from that door and maintain your position as directed by base command." The statement hung in the air like a thunderclap. Hawthorne stared at her in complete shock, unable to process what he had just heard. "What did you just say?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I said, I am ordering you to comply with the base commander's lockdown directive," Alexandra repeated, her posture straightening as years of command presence reasserted itself. Rodriguez stepped closer, her experienced eye taking in details she had previously missed. The way Alexandra carried herself, the natural authority in her voice, the tactical awareness she had displayed throughout the crisis. "Who exactly are you?" Rodriguez asked quietly. Alexandra met her gaze directly, knowing that the moment of truth had finally arrived. The mission parameters that had governed her behavior for weeks were no longer sustainable in the face of immediate danger to base security and military discipline. Hawthorne found his voice again, though it cracked with disbelief. "You can't order me to do anything. You're a civilian contractor." Alexandra's expression remained calm but firm. "Actually, Major, I'm not." The simple statement carried implications that everyone in the room was beginning to understand. Santos moved closer, her tactical instincts recognizing the shift in command dynamics. Morrison's eyes widened as pieces began falling into place. The way she had handled herself during the crisis, her obvious knowledge of military procedures, her unshakable composure under pressure. The radio crackled with another update. Final sweep in progress. Maintain current positions for approximately 5 more minutes. But no one in the coffee shop was paying attention to the radio anymore. All focus had shifted to Alexandra as the revelation of her true identity became inevitable. The silence in the coffee shop stretched like a taut wire as everyone processed Alexandra's words. Hawthorne's face cycled through confusion, disbelief, and growing alarm as the implications began to sink in. "If you're not a civilian contractor," Kellen said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper, "then what are you?" Alexandra reached into her apron pocket and withdrew a military identification card that she had kept hidden for weeks. The gesture was deliberate and measured, carrying the weight of revelation that would transform everything everyone thought they knew about the situation. "Brigadier General Alexandra Reeves," she said clearly, presenting her credentials. "United States Army." The words hit the assembled group like a physical blow. Morrison stumbled backward, his face draining of color as he realized he had been watching a 2-star general serve coffee while officers treated her with casual disrespect. Hawthorne stared at the identification card as though it might be some kind of elaborate forgery. "That's impossible," he stammered. "You've been working here for weeks. You're just a barista." Rodriguez stepped closer to examine the credentials, her experienced eye immediately recognizing their authenticity. Her expression shifted from surprise to something approaching awe as she processed the full implications. Santos moved to attention automatically, her military training overriding the surreal nature of the situation. "Ma'am," she said with crisp professionalism. Alexandra nodded acknowledgement to the sergeant while maintaining her focus on the officers who had spent weeks treating her as beneath their notice. "Gentlemen, I have been conducting an undercover assessment of leadership climate and command effectiveness at Fort Henderson." Kellen's mouth opened and closed soundlessly as he struggled to form words. "You're a general," he finally managed. "A real general. The highest-ranking officer currently on this base," Alexandra confirmed. "And as such, I am directing you to comply immediately with Colonel Whitmore's lockdown orders." Hawthorne's hand finally released the door handle as the reality of his situation crashed down upon him. He had been preparing to disobey direct orders in front of a general officer, had spent weeks insulting and dismissing someone who outranked him by 2 full grades. "Ma'am," Morrison said quietly, his voice shaking with embarrassment and fear, "I apologize for any disrespectful behavior. I didn't know." Alexandra's expression softened slightly as she looked at the young lieutenant. Morrison had shown potential for growth and had begun questioning the leadership examples he was following. His apology carried genuine remorse rather than self-serving damage control. "Lieutenant Morrison," she said kindly, "you have nothing to apologize for. Your behavior has been consistently professional and appropriate." The radio crackled with a final update. "All clear. Security threat neutralized. All personnel may resume normal activities. Lockdown is officially lifted." But the announcement felt almost anticlimactic compared to the drama unfolding within the coffee shop. The external crisis had been resolved, but a more significant reckoning was just beginning. Rodriguez was studying Alexandra with newfound understanding. "That's why you handled everything so perfectly," she said with quiet amazement. "The way you managed difficult situations, your knowledge of military procedures, your complete composure under pressure." 23 years of active service, Alexandra replied. "Multiple combat deployments. I've commanded brigade-level operations in 3 different theaters." Santos shook her head in wonder. "And we just watched these officers treat you like you were invisible." Hawthorne seemed to be having difficulty breathing as the full scope of his situation became clear. He had systematically harassed and belittled a general officer for weeks, had questioned her competence and place in the military hierarchy, had threatened to file complaints about her attitude. "General Reeves," he said, his voice barely functional. "I had no idea. If I had known." "That's exactly the point, Major," Alexander interrupted firmly. You had no idea, but you made assumptions based on job title and appearance rather than observing actual competence and character. Kellen stood frozen in horror, realizing that every condescending comment, every dismissive gesture, every moment of casual cruelty had been witnessed and documented by someone with the authority to end his career with a single report. The coffee shop that had been a stage for weeks of casual harassment had suddenly transformed into a tribunal where military justice and professional accountability were about to be dispensed by someone who had observed every transgression with perfect clarity. Morrison looked between his superiors and the general, beginning to understand that he was witnessing a moment that would fundamentally change his understanding of leadership, respect, and military professionalism. The weight of revelation settled over the coffee shop like a heavy blanket. Alexandra removed her apron with deliberate precision, each movement carrying the authority of someone who had commanded thousands of soldiers in life-or-death situations. The transformation from barista to general was complete, and the shift in power dynamics was absolute. General Reeves, Rodriguez said with genuine respect, "Your assessment mission must have provided invaluable insights into our base operations." Alexander nodded, while maintaining her focus on the officers who were still processing the magnitude of their situation. "It has been quite educational, Staff Sergeant. I've observed leadership styles, crisis management capabilities, and most importantly, how personnel treat others when they believe no one of consequence is watching." Hawthorne's face had gone from red to ashen as he began calculating the potential consequences of weeks of documented harassment. His career, his reputation, his entire future in the military hung in the balance of what this general had witnessed and recorded. "Ma'am," he said with desperate formality, "I want to emphasize that my behavior was never intended to be disrespectful to military authority. I simply didn't realize." Alexandra's expression remained neutral, but her eyes carried the weight of judgment. "Major Hawthorne, your behavior was disrespectful to human dignity, regardless of military rank. The fact that you treated someone poorly because you believed they couldn't affect your career reveals significant character deficiencies." Santos observed the exchange with fascination, watching a masterclass in leadership accountability unfold before her eyes. This was how real military justice worked when competent authority was applied to documented misconduct. Kellen attempted to follow Hawthorne's strategy of damage control. "General, I hope you understand that we were simply maintaining military standards and ensuring proper respect for hierarchy." The statement was so obviously false that Alexandra almost smiled. "Captain Kellen, I have detailed observations of your behavior over several weeks. Nothing I witnessed resembled maintenance of military standards. What I saw was systematic harassment, abuse of perceived authority, and the creation of a hostile work environment." Morrison stood at rigid attention, his face pale but his posture correct. Unlike his superiors, he seemed to understand that explanations and excuses would only make his situation worse. "Lieutenant Morrison," Alexandra said, addressing him directly, "you showed the capacity for independent thought and growth during your time here. That speaks well of your potential as a military leader." Morrison's relief was visible, but he maintained his professional composure. "Thank you, ma'am. I learned a great deal from observing the staff here, especially about treating everyone with dignity regardless of their position." Alexandra appreciated the young officer's recognition of the real lesson that should have been learned. Military leadership was fundamentally about bringing out the best in everyone, not establishing dominance through intimidation or casual cruelty. Rodriguez stepped forward with obvious curiosity. "General, what will happen to your findings from this assessment?" Alexandra's expression became more serious as she considered the implications of her mission. "My report will document significant systemic issues with leadership climate and crisis management capabilities. The behavior I witnessed during today's security incident was particularly concerning. The reminder of their poor performance during the actual crisis added another layer to Hawthorne and Kellen's growing problems. Not only had they harassed a general officer, but they had also demonstrated dangerous incompetence during a real security emergency. Santos nodded with understanding. The way some people acted today showed they're not ready for real leadership responsibilities. Alexandra agreed completely. Effective military leadership requires character, competence, and genuine concern for mission accomplishment and troop welfare. What I observed from certain individuals was the opposite of those qualities. Hawthorne made one final desperate attempt to salvage his situation. General Reeves, I want to assure you that I am committed to learning from this experience and improving my leadership approach. Alexandra studied him with the practiced eye of someone who had evaluated countless officers throughout her career. Major, genuine change requires acknowledging the full scope of problematic behavior and demonstrating sustained improvement over time. That process begins with taking complete responsibility rather than making excuses. The coffee shop had become a classroom where fundamental lessons about military professionalism, human dignity, and authentic leadership were being taught by someone with the authority and experience to make those lessons permanent. Kelland remained silent, apparently recognizing that anything he said would only further document his unfitness for military leadership responsibilities. 3 weeks later, the coffee shop at Fort Henderson operated under dramatically different circumstances. Alexandra had returned to her official duties as Brigadier General, but the transformation she had witnessed and catalyzed continued to ripple throughout the base's command structure. Lieutenant Morrison approached the counter where a new civilian contractor worked alongside Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who had volunteered to help train replacement personnel. His demeanor had evolved from uncertain mimicry to genuine professional confidence. "Good morning," Rodriguez said cheerfully. Morrison smiled and returned the greeting with authentic warmth rather than forced authority. "Morning, Staff Sergeant. Regular coffee, please. And thank you for everything you've taught me about real leadership." Rodriguez beamed with pride at his development. "You figured it out yourself, Lieutenant. I just provided some examples to follow." Colonel Whitmore entered the coffee shop, his presence commanding immediate attention, but not the fearful tension that had previously accompanied visits from senior officers. The base commander had implemented sweeping changes based on General Reeves's assessment report. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," he said with genuine respect, "I wanted to personally thank you for your exemplary leadership during the security incident. Your actions prevented a serious breach of protocol that could have compromised the entire operation." Rodriguez accepted the recognition with characteristic humility. "Just doing my job, sir," though I had some excellent guidance from someone who knew what real leadership looked like. The reference to General Reeves brought smiles from everyone present. Her undercover assessment had become legendary throughout Fort Henderson, a story that would be told for years as an example of how authentic leadership could emerge from unexpected places. Santos appeared in the doorway, her promotion to Sergeant First Class evident in her updated uniform. The recognition of her competence and character had accelerated her advancement through the ranks. "Good afternoon, everyone," she said, her confidence visibly enhanced by the validation she had received. "The new training program is showing excellent results. Junior officers are learning to lead through example rather than intimidation." Morrison nodded enthusiastically. "It's amazing how different everything feels when leaders focus on bringing out the best in people instead of putting them in their place." Colonel Whitmore's expression grew more serious as he addressed the group. "I want everyone to understand that the changes we've implemented are permanent. General Reeves's assessment revealed problems that went far beyond individual misconduct. We're building a culture based on competence, character, and genuine respect for every person who contributes to our mission." The transformation was evident in every interaction. Personnel moved with purpose and pride rather than fear and resentment. The toxic atmosphere that had characterized certain areas of the base had been replaced by professional camaraderie and mutual respect. Rodriguez glanced toward the window, where General Reeves could be seen crossing the courtyard, her presence now official but no less commanding than when she had worked anonymously behind a coffee counter. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "the general taught us something important about assumptions and appearances. Competence and character can be found in unexpected places, but only if we're looking for the right things. Morrison agreed completely. I learned more about leadership from watching her handle difficult situations as a barista than I did from months of following the wrong examples. Santos smiled at the memory. The way she maintained her dignity and professionalism, even when people were treating her poorly, showed real strength. That's the kind of leader I want to become. Colonel Whitmore nodded approvingly. That's exactly the kind of leader this base needs. People who understand that authority comes from competence and character, not from rank alone. The coffee shop had transformed from a stage for harassment and intimidation into a symbol of positive change throughout Fort Henderson. The lessons learned during those crucial weeks continued to influence every aspect of base operations. If this story of hidden strength and authentic leadership moved you, drop a comment and let us know your favorite moment, or share about someone you know who surprised everyone with their true capabilities. Sometimes the most powerful leaders are the ones we least expect, and the most important lessons come from watching how people treat others when they think no one important is watching. The legacy of General Reeves's assessment would endure long after her official duties took her elsewhere. Fort Henderson had learned that true military excellence emerged from treating every person with dignity, recognizing competence wherever it appeared, and understanding that authentic leadership was about character rather than position. Rodriguez raised her coffee cup in a small toast. To real leadership, she said quietly, "May we always recognize it when we see it, and may we always strive to embody it ourselves." The sentiment echoed throughout the transformed base, a reminder that the most powerful changes often began with the simplest act of treating others with respect and dignity.